Dr. Georgette Bennett, it's so good to meet you. And I loved watching your video and reading about you. And I loved your advice that you give to people who are overwhelmed when they think about how to help in a crisis, especially with everything going on in Ukraine right now, and probably the biggest refugee crisis that we'll see since World War II. You say if someone wants to help, find something small and something they can do. Find an actual area where they can solve a problem and scale up. Tell me more about that. How did you come across that concept of advice?
By living it, because I've had a very diverse career. I started out as a criminologist, I guess the first 20 years of my career, and have had the privilege of actually being involved at the start of a number of movements. But I always approached an issue trying to find an angle that was different from the way it was being approached. Later in my career, I became very much involved in intergroup relations, especially interreligious relations. So I founded an organization called the Tannenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding. We look at education, how do you teach about religion? But everybody else was focusing on how you teach it in high school, and yet attitudes are formed in the primary grades. So we developed programs for the primary grades. Workplace 2000, as the millennium approached, everybody was looking at diversity as a core issue in Workplace 2000, but nobody was looking at the religious dimension of diversity, even though demographics were undergoing dramatic shifts, and it was obvious that religion in the workplace was going to become a very big issue, but nobody was addressing it. So when it came to the Syrian crisis, I took the same approach. I mean, how do you look at an issue that is so overwhelming? You mentioned before that the Ukraine refugee crisis is likely to be the largest since World War II. I think it's unlikely. Actually, Syrian refugees make up the largest percentage of refugees in the world. But how do you approach it? How do you find something doable that's going to make a difference? Well, in this case, I wasn't seeing a response from the Jewish community to the Syrian crisis. And it would seem kind of counterintuitive that the Jewish community should be mobilized to respond to the Syrian crisis. But it wasn't. It wasn't counterintuitive. It actually turned out to be a very important response. And from there, we scaled up to a multi-faith response. And then what do you do beyond advocacy, which isn't something you can really measure? You know, of course, we did a lot of advocacy in Washington, and we did advocacy in the European Parliament, the UK Parliament, the Canadian Parliament, every level of government in Israel. And we found something that was very doable and made a huge difference. What did we find? How do you get to hard to access areas in Syria? Because the big boys were dealing with all the easier to access areas, you know, the International Rescue Committee and so on. Well, one person can't compete with organizations like that. So we found southwest Syria, which was entirely surrounded by the regime. And as you know, Mika, the regime does not allow any humanitarian aid to reach areas it doesn't control. So nothing was getting into southwest Syria, some through Jordan, but very little of it was reaching the intended recipient. But that hard to access area was very easy to access through Israel, through the Golan Heights. So there was a real man bites dog story.
I love your advice. It actually applies to anybody who wants
Yes.
to help in any situation, and that's, start small and scale up, find a gap that needs to be filled and fill it, and then go from there. So Dr. Georgette Bennett, thank you so much for the work that you are doing to help Syrian refugees. And thank you for being at the 3050 Summit.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm honored to be here, and thank you for everything that you do. I'm Dr. Georgette Bennett, and I'm the founder of the Multifaith Alliance for Syrian Refugees. And our mission is to provide humanitarian assistance for Syrian war victims and to advocate on behalf of Syrian refugees. We hear a lot about terrible catastrophes going on throughout the world. A lot of humanitarian crises, a lot of refugee crises. And people want to help, they really do. But they end up feeling helpless in the face of an overwhelming catastrophe. So one of the skills that I picked up is figuring out how one can find an entry point when it comes to confronting an enormous problem. So rule number one is don't focus on the big picture, because if you focus on the big picture, you'll be paralyzed into inaction. Find an entry point. In the case of Syrian refugees, in my case, we were talking about mobilizing a response in the Jewish community as a starting point. And from there, we scaled up to a multi-faith response. Once finding an entry point, we had to identify a gap that needed to be filled, because what you don't want to do is be duplicating what others are doing, especially the large international organizations, because you really can't compete with those. So the gap that we identified was hard to access parts of Syria that a lot of other organizations were not able to reach. And we were able to access the southwest part of Syria through Israel, which may seem very counterintuitive, but that shared border made it possible for us to deliver massive amounts of aid directly into southwest Syria. Up until now, we've been able to deliver $225 million in aid, most of it directly into Syria. And we've benefited 2.3 million war victims, and still counting. Now, to be able to do something like this yourself, just follow this formula. Find an entry point, identify a gap, and then find something doable with which to fill that gap. In our case, the doable thing that we were able to do was to deliver aid through Israel over the Golan Heights directly into Syria. And when that channel shut down because of a major incursion by the regime, where they ended up taking over that part of Syria where the Assad regime took it over, we simply expanded our delivery area and found other hard-to-access areas in northwest Syria and northeast Syria. And we were able to keep on going, and we are going still. So that's the formula. Find an entry point, identify a gap, find something doable to fill that gap, and stay tightly focused on that.